The courtroom was filled with the low murmur of restless voices, the shuffle of papers, and the impatient tapping of pens. It was just another ordinary day in the system, another defendant brought in, another face behind cold steel cuffs. The officers at the back barely lifted their eyes when they escorted her in. To them, she was just one more name on the docket, another accused individual about to be judged and dismissed. Her calmness was mistaken for resignation, her silence for guilt. The bailiff called for order, and the chatter dimmed, but the atmosphere still carried the heavy scent of indifference. She stood tall, yet her composure went unnoticed. Her hair was tied back neatly, not in vanity, but precision. There was no plea in her eyes, no defiance either. Only an eerie steadiness that made one wonder if she understood what was happening around her. The officers thought they did her a favor by not tightening the cuffs too much. One even smirked, whispering something about how quiet ones always break first. To them, she was a criminal wrapped in a calm disguise, not worth a second thought. The judge glanced over his glasses, reading the charges as if they were lines he had recited 1,000 times before. The prosecutor leaned forward, eager to begin, confident this would be another easy case. In a room that prided itself on procedure, no one cared to question the odd aura that seemed to hover around her. She didn't shift nervously. She didn't look around for sympathy. She didn't even blink when the gavel struck. It was as though she'd stood in far harsher places than this. Outside, the news vans idled, ready to capture another headline. Inside, cameras clicked, pens scratched, and the machine of justice rolled forward. Everyone thought they knew her story. A woman in the wrong place, the wrong time, caught in something she couldn't control. They didn't know that control was the very essence of her existence. They didn't know she had been trained to maintain calm under sniper fire, to regulate her breathing while chaos erupted around her, to make decisions that meant life or death for those beside her. But here, in the fluorescent glow of a courtroom, none of that mattered. The officers flanked her on both sides, their posture relaxed but their judgment clear. One whispered something about how it didn't add up, that she didn't look like the type. The other shrugged. They all look normal until they're not, he muttered. They couldn't see that she was assessing everything. Exits, distances, the layout of the room. Not in defiance, but in instinct. It was second nature. She had done it in deserts, in cities, in places where silence could mean survival. The murmurs of the crowd carried whispers of gossip and speculation. People judged her by her clothes, her expression, her silence. Someone in the back whispered that she looked too composed, maybe heartless. They didn't understand that composure was carved into her by years of discipline, forged in places where emotion was a luxury. They couldn't know that her stillness was the same kind of stillness that once preceded a mission, the kind of control that made her one of the deadliest marksmen alive. Every sound in that courtroom echoed differently for her. The metallic clink of handcuffs, the creak of wood under the judge's chair, the distant hum of air conditioning. She processed it all. Every detail was filed away, every noise mapped in her mind. To her, it wasn't fear that filled the room, it was pattern. To everyone else, she was another name in a file. But to her, this was just another environment to adapt to. The defense attorney spoke on her behalf, but his words drifted past her like a forgotten echo. She wasn't worried about what was said. She was observing, analyzing. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, but it felt more like an ambush of misunderstanding. Every eye in that room was heavy with assumption, the kind that saw a woman in handcuffs and immediately decided who she was. A journalist scribbled down a line about a quiet defendant facing serious charges. Another reporter whispered about her strangely calm demeanor. They wanted a story of drama, of downfall. They didn't realize the real story hadn't even begun. She stood there, wrists bound, as they wrote her narrative for her, blind to the truth that was about to unravel their certainty. Each second stretched as if time itself were testing her patience. The officers thought she was nervous. In reality, she was timing her breathing, for seconds in, for seconds out. Her mind wasn't consumed by fear. It was disciplined, focused. The courtroom might have seen a prisoner, but she stood like a soldier awaiting orders. Her eyes didn't dart around the room. They moved with quiet precision. Everything about her presence contradicted the image they had already built in their minds. And still, no one asked who she really was. No one asked why she seemed utterly unshaken. They assumed she was like all the rest, fragile, frightened, guilty. The cuffs were their proof. The file was their evidence. But assumptions, like silence, can be deceiving. In that courtroom, surrounded by judgment and noise, they failed to see the truth standing right in front of them, calm, restrained, and infinitely more than they could ever imagine. Her calmness unsettled the officers more than any outburst could have. As they led her through the narrow hallway toward the courtroom, the chains rattled softly against her wrists, but her steps were even, deliberate, almost too controlled. There was no trembling in her hands, no nervous glance at the faces around her. She walked like someone who had memorized the weight of discipline, who had stood at attention under harsher eyes than these. Every move she made seemed intentional, measured, not the movement of a frightened woman, but of someone who understood command and restraint. To the casual observer, she was quiet. To those who understood composure, she was trained. The subtle way she kept her shoulders aligned, the precision with which she turned her head, the way her breathing never once faltered, all of it betrayed something deeper than innocence or guilt. It revealed years of conditioning, years spent in places where a heartbeat too loud could give away your position. Yet no one in that courtroom recognized it. They mistook her control for indifference, her silence for shame. Her eyes never lingered too long on anyone. They shifted smoothly, calculating, taking in details, exits, positions, uniforms, habits. She noted the bailiff's dominant hand, the distance between her and the judge, the nearest route to the door. It wasn't defiance, it was instinct, the kind of awareness that never truly leaves someone trained to survive under fire. Even the smallest twitch of her fingers seemed to follow a rhythm she had mastered long ago, a rhythm of breath, motion, and control. Her stillness wasn't the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to find peace in chaos. The courtroom might have been a place of law and order, but to her, it was another battlefield, not of bullets, but of judgment, assumption, and scrutiny. Every look thrown her way was another shot fired, every whisper another explosion of doubt. And yet, she stood untouched, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had learned how to absorb pressure without breaking. When the officers tightened their grip, she didn't flinch. Her mind registered the gesture, measured the tension in their hands, calculated how many pounds of force it would take to break free, not because she planned to, but because her brain worked that way. Years of training had rewired her reflexes. Discipline wasn't just something she followed. It had become her nature. Every breath was deliberate, every muscle under command. The prosecutor misread her silence as arrogance. "You don't have anything to say for yourself?" he asked, expecting a plea, a tear, a moment of weakness. She only looked at him with steady eyes, the kind of gaze that once looked through a rifle scope across a desert horizon. He couldn't understand why that gaze made him uneasy. He thought she was defiant, but what he really saw was focus, the same kind that had steadied her hands while the world around her erupted in chaos. Even the judge felt something different about her presence. He couldn't put it into words, but the air seemed to shift when she entered. It wasn't aggression, but gravity, the quiet weight of someone who had carried real responsibility. Most people crumble when facing judgment. She simply stood. The courtroom was used to guilt, denial, anger, but calm? Calm made them uneasy. Calm made them question what they thought they knew. Her posture told a story no file could. Straight spine, shoulders back, chin slightly lowered. The stance of someone trained to wait for orders, to respect authority, but not to fear it. She didn't fidget, didn't look for validation, didn't try to convince anyone of her innocence. She had learned long ago that control was power, and that silence could speak louder than any argument. The bailiff noticed it first, that strange steadiness. "You've been through this before?" he whispered half-jokingly, trying to break the tension. She looked at him briefly, then away, saying nothing. He thought she was ignoring him, but in truth, she was simply observing. She had learned not to respond to unnecessary noise. The habit of silence was ingrained in her from missions where a single word could mean exposure. When she sat, she did so without hesitation, her movements fluid and precise. No wasted motion, no restless shifting. Even her breathing seemed synchronized, 4 in, 4 out, no deviation. The courtroom, unaware of what they were witnessing, mistook it for eerie detachment. But this wasn't detachment, it was discipline. The same discipline that had guided her through sniper school, through endless nights of training, through the unbearable silence of waiting for a target that might never come. Every second, she remained in control of herself. Her thoughts, her body, her breathing, all aligned in quiet mastery. The officers beside her grew restless. They couldn't place it, but something about her calm unnerved them. They were used to people breaking under pressure, pleading, explaining. She did none of that. She simply existed within her own focus, as though the noise of the courtroom belonged to another world entirely. To everyone else, her stillness seemed unnatural, but to her, it was survival. It was who she had been trained to be. Years of missions had taught her that control wasn't a choice. It was the difference between life and death. That same discipline now wrapped around her like invisible armor, shielding her from the chaos of judgment and misunderstanding that filled the room. And while they all saw a quiet, restrained woman, they failed to see the truth hiding beneath that composure, the unshakable calm of a SEAL sniper, standing unrecognized among those who had no idea what true control looked like. The signs were all there, but no one cared to see them. The faint scars along her knuckles, the thin white line near her jaw, the subtle mark across her wrist where years of handling cold steel had left their imprint. They told stories that no courtroom file ever could. She wore her history quietly, not as decoration, but as truth. Each mark had meaning, each detail a fragment of a life lived far from ordinary. Yet in the fluorescent light of that courtroom, they were invisible to the eyes trained only to see guilt or innocence. When she raised her hands to adjust the cuffs, the trident tattoo flashed briefly beneath her sleeve. It was small, faded from time and exposure, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what it meant. The symbol of an elite brotherhood, or in her case, a rare sisterhood, that most civilians would never recognize. The officers standing nearby didn't notice. Their eyes slid past it, uninterested, dismissive. To them, it was just ink, like a youthful mistake or a symbol of rebellion. They couldn't comprehend the weight that mark carried, the years of discipline, endurance, and pain it represented. Her breathing was the quiet rhythm of someone who had spent too many nights waiting for the sound of danger. It wasn't the shallow, anxious breathing of the nervous. It was steady, controlled, deliberate. For seconds in, for seconds out, the same cycle that had steadied her hand through wind, distance, and time. In the courtroom silence, no one noticed. They mistook her focus for detachment, unaware that beneath that calm exterior, every detail of the room was being mapped and measured. Even her eyes held stories. They were the kind of eyes that had seen the world from behind a scope, eyes that didn't just look, they calculated. She wasn't watching the room, she was assessing it. The exits, the number of people, the distance between herself and every door. The habit was unconscious, instinctual. Once learned, it never left. The court officers shifted their stance occasionally, trying to make sense of the quiet intensity that seemed to emanate from her without a word. Her hands, though bound, were never truly still. The movement was minimal, almost invisible, but the tension in her fingers spoke of someone used to precision. They were not the trembling hands of fear, but the calm hands of control. The same hands that once dismantled rifles in the dark, that had held her comrades steady under fire, that had pulled a trigger with the certainty of duty, not vengeance. The marks on her skin weren't rough or careless. They were deliberate reminders of everything she had done to survive. Her posture remained unyielding, her back straight, her chin lowered slightly, but never in submission. The courtroom's gaze could not penetrate the armor of her bearing. It was subtle, but it carried an authority that didn't come from arrogance. It came from experience. She stood the way soldiers do, balanced, ready, centered. The kind of posture that told of endless drills, of muscle memory carved through repetition, of an unspoken readiness for whatever might come next. A few spectators in the back whispered about how unusual she looked for someone accused. One mentioned the tattoo, another commented on the scars, but their voices faded quickly into the hum of routine. To them, these details meant nothing. They saw only surface, a woman who seemed too composed, too collected for her situation. They didn't know those faint lines were written in sweat, not vanity. They didn't see that her calm wasn't practiced, it was ingrained. When the bailiff asked her to rise, she did so with the quiet strength of someone used to command. Her movements were exact, efficient, with no hesitation. The officers nearby shifted awkwardly, uncertain why her simple act of standing felt so deliberate. Even in restraint, she carried herself like someone accustomed to authority, not submission. The same discipline that had once governed her missions now guided her every gesture. The trident tattoo caught the light again when she adjusted the chain around her wrist. The faint shimmer drew a fleeting glance from a reporter, but it passed as quickly as it came. No one in that room understood its significance. No one realized that it wasn't just a mark of identity, but a badge of belonging to one of the most elite fighting units in existence. The ink had faded, but the meaning hadn't. It was a reminder of vows made, of comrades lost, of missions that never reached headlines. Her silence was heavy with presence. It wasn't avoidance or fear, but restraint. The kind of restraint that only comes from someone who has lived under pressure more intense than any courtroom could offer. She had learned how to hold her breath for minutes, how to wait in stillness while the world around her roared. That same discipline now shielded her as people judged without knowing. Every trace on her body, every habit of movement, every steady breath was evidence of a different life. But in that courtroom, those clues went unnoticed. No one there had ever looked into the eyes of a sniper. No one there had ever understood what it meant to carry that kind of precision in one's bones. They saw a quiet woman in handcuffs, not the warrior hidden beneath the surface. The signs were in plain sight, the scars, the ink, the poise, the control, but their meaning was lost on those who never learned to look beyond what was visible. The officer standing nearest to her had grown uneasy. Something about her composure didn't fit the picture painted by her case file. She didn't fidget or plead like others he had escorted into that same courtroom. Her stillness wasn't submission, it was awareness. When the judge called for a short recess, he found himself staring at her ID, half out of curiosity, half out of a feeling he couldn't quite name. The laminated card felt ordinary in his hands, but the name printed on it seemed familiar, as if he had read it somewhere before. Maybe in an article or a briefing long forgotten. He hesitated, then swiped it through the database system, expecting nothing more than a standard record. The computer screen blinked once, processing slowly, the soft hum of the machine filling the air. Around him, the chatter of the courtroom blurred into background noise. Then the file opened, and a list of classifications and commendations flooded the screen. For a second, he thought it was an error. The header read, Classified, Tier 1 Personnel. Beneath it, words appeared that didn't belong in a criminal report. SEAL Team 6, Confirmed Sniper, Silver Star, Joint Special Operations Command. His heart skipped. He scrolled down, each line heavier than the last. The file wasn't a record of arrest, but a record of service. He looked up from the monitor, his eyes darting toward her. She was still standing quietly, her face unreadable, her breathing calm, as if she already knew what he had just discovered. The air seemed to thicken around him. His pulse quickened, his mouth suddenly dry. The realization hit him all at once. The woman he had handcuffed, the one he had dismissed as another defendant, had once been part of one of the most elite and secretive military units in the world. The officer beside him noticed his reaction. "What is it?" he asked, leaning closer. Without answering, the first officer turned the screen slightly, just enough for his partner to read the top line. The second man's face drained of color. His eyes widened as he took in the information, each word sinking in with disbelief. Neither spoke. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed louder, sharper, cutting through the stunned silence between them. Across the room, the defense attorney continued speaking to the judge, unaware of the shift in energy spreading from the back of the courtroom. The two officers exchanged a look, the kind that passes between people who have both seen something they can't unsee. Their earlier casual confidence had evaporated. The realization carried weight, not just of authority, but of guilt. They had placed restraints on someone who had once worn a uniform that demanded the highest respect. One of them reached for the document printer, his hand trembling slightly. The file came out in slow mechanical whirs, each sheet stamped with seals and clearances far above their pay grade. The room had suddenly become too small, the air too heavy. He read the words again, silently mouthing them, as though repetition might make them less impossible. Naval Special Warfare Command. Decorated Sniper. Operation Black Dagger. Each entry read like something out of a report meant to be locked away in secure archives, not sitting in a courtroom database. When the officer turned toward her again, his perception had shifted completely. He no longer saw a detainee. He saw the precision in her stance, the reason behind her quiet authority, the discipline that radiated even through chains. Every detail that had once seemed odd, her calm breathing, her posture, her eyes, now made perfect sense. She wasn't trying to be composed. She was composed because she had been trained to operate under pressures far greater than this. The file contained mission codes, references to operations marked confidential, records of service in war zones they had only ever seen on the news. There were commendations for marksmanship, leadership, and valor under fire. The deeper he read, the more his chest tightened. The woman they had brought in as a suspect had once been responsible for saving lives, countless ones. Her name, once spoken in military briefings, was now echoing silently in a courtroom that had no idea of her past. He could feel the weight of the mistake settling into his chest. The uniform he wore suddenly felt too light, too unworthy. He remembered the rough way he had guided her through the metal detector, the dismissive glance he had given when she didn't respond to his orders fast enough. Now, every moment replayed in his mind with bitter clarity. The lines between authority and ignorance blurred in front of him. The chief entered moments later, drawn by the sudden tension. One of the officers handed him the printed document without a word. The chief's eyes scanned the first few lines, then stopped. His jaw tensed. The silence between them was broken only by the faint rustle of paper in his hands. He looked across the room, his gaze landing on her. She stood motionless, not proud, not angry, simply aware. The chief's expression faltered. He had seen soldiers like her before, men and women forged by service, bound by secrecy, defined by quiet strength. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. The air of judgment that had filled the space only moments before was replaced by unease. The judge, sensing something had changed, looked up in confusion as the officers whispered hurriedly at the back. The file lay open on the desk, glowing faintly under the light, its classified markings reflecting the reality that no one had been prepared to face. The officer who had run the search stood frozen, the weight of revelation pressing down on him. Every assumption, every careless thought about who she was, shattered under the truth now staring him in the face. The shift in the room was immediate, though no one could name it. It began with silence, a kind that spread like ripples on still water. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves understood the gravity of what had just been discovered. Conversations faltered, papers stopped rustling, and even the distant hum of the ceiling fans seemed to fade into a muted pulse. Every eye that had once looked at her with judgment now searched her face for meaning. The realization had spread like electricity, and with it came an unease that no one could disguise. The officer who held her file couldn't bring himself to speak. He simply stared, his expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet regret. The chief's voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, but carried a tremor he couldn't hide. "Release her," he said. The command broke the silence, yet no one moved right away. It wasn't hesitation out of defiance, but out of shock. They had handcuffed someone whose name belonged in a record of valor, not on a docket of criminal charges. The realization struck each of them differently. For some, it was shame. For others, awe. The judge set down his pen slowly, his brow furrowed in confusion as he scanned the room. He didn't yet know what had changed, but he could feel the weight of it pressing against the air. The attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. The defense lawyer, unaware of the revelation at first, looked around as if waiting for someone to explain the sudden tension. Then he saw the officer removing her cuffs, his hands trembling as the steel came undone. The faint click echoed louder than it should have, filling the space with a sound that carried apology more than authority. Her wrists were marked faintly where the cuffs had pressed against the skin, but she didn't rub them. She didn't look at anyone. Her composure remained unbroken, her posture unchanged. The same calm that had unsettled them before now commanded their respect. The officers stepped back, their movements careful, almost reverent. No one wanted to meet her eyes, but everyone wanted to. They all seemed to feel the same thing, that they had been in the presence of something greater than they had realized. The chief cleared his throat, his voice quieter this time as he spoke to the judge. "Sir, there's been a development," he said, sliding the printed file across the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses, the light from the monitor reflecting faintly in his lenses as he read. The room watched him, waiting. His expression changed with every line. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally stillness. He leaned back slightly, the papers trembling faintly in his hand. The courtroom, a place designed for control and order, now felt like it was standing on the edge of something uncertain. No one whispered now. Even the journalist who had been poised for scandal forgot to take notes. The silence felt sacred, as though to speak would violate something unspoken. The same people who had judged her an hour earlier now looked at her with a quiet reverence. The uniformed officers who had led her in so confidently now seemed smaller, their movements awkward, unsure. The authority that once filled the space had shifted to her, not through words or demands, but through presence alone. The judge's voice, when it finally came, was soft and hesitant. "Is this accurate?" he asked, looking from the file to her. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes lifted just enough to meet his gaze, and the calm there made him falter. It wasn't arrogance or pride. It was simply truth, a truth she had no need to defend. The file answered for her. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, thicker than any plea. The officers who stood at the back exchanged uneasy glances, each feeling the weight of their earlier actions settle deeper. The one who had cuffed her could still hear the sound of the metal closing around her wrists. Now it replayed in his mind like a reminder of everything he hadn't seen, everything he hadn't known. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but words felt empty against the truth sitting silently before him. The chief turned toward her with a look that held both respect and regret. For years he had trained men to recognize strength, to sense danger, to see the difference between control and defiance. Yet somehow, standing before this woman, he realized how blind authority could become when it stopped paying attention. She hadn't needed to prove herself. Her very existence did that for her. The journalists finally stirred, their pens moving hesitantly, as if afraid to misrepresent what they were witnessing. But even as they wrote, they knew no headline could capture it. The story that had begun as another courtroom proceeding had transformed into something else entirely. A reckoning of perception, of ignorance, of quiet strength misunderstood. Every person in that room had seen her differently now, and in seeing her, they saw their own error reflected back. The officer placed the open file on the table beside her, the official seals catching the light. He stepped back, unsure where to stand, unsure what to say. The same woman he had thought fragile now stood taller than anyone in the room, not because of power or authority, but because of truth. The silence stretched on, the courtroom holding its breath as if afraid to disturb her calm. The shock had passed, replaced by something deeper, respect mingled with shame, and a quiet understanding that nothing about this day would be easily forgotten. The truth hung in the air like a living thing, heavy and undeniable. They had walked her into that courtroom believing she was another face in a long line of defendants, But now every detail of the morning played back through their minds with a different meaning. The way she had stood still when the cuffs closed around her wrists, the faint calm in her breathing, the unflinching steadiness of her gaze. None of it belonged to someone broken or guilty. It belonged to someone trained to withstand pressure that most people could never comprehend. The realization tore through the room quietly, reshaping everything they thought they knew about her. The officers couldn't look at her the same way anymore. The same hands that had held her by the arms now seemed clumsy, almost disrespectful. They remembered her silence not as submission but as discipline. Her stillness, once mistaken for fear, now looked like control. It was hard to believe they had placed restraints on someone who had once operated in places where hesitation meant death. The chains had looked like a symbol of authority before, but now they felt like an insult. The judge sat motionless, staring at the papers before him, his lips pressed into a thin line. The defense attorney, who had been preparing an argument to prove her innocence, now seemed lost, his notes meaningless. The prosecutor who had been ready to condemn her kept his eyes down, as if looking at her might remind him of his own assumptions. No one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, dense with regret, shame, and awe. She remained the only calm presence in the room. Even freed from the cuffs, her posture didn't change. She didn't gloat, didn't react, didn't even move her hands. She stood with the same quiet authority that had unsettled them before, the same quiet that soldiers carry long after the battlefield is gone. Every person who had seen her as weak now understood what strength truly looked like. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, it didn't demand recognition. It simply existed, unshaken. The chief took a step closer to her, his expression uncertain. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words felt too small for what had happened. There was a line between protocol and humanity, and he knew now which side he had failed to stand on. The realization hit harder than any reprimand could. He had cuffed a hero, a sniper, a protector, someone who had lived through moments that most men wouldn't survive. And he had treated her like a criminal because she hadn't fit the image of what he thought a soldier looked like. Across the courtroom, one of the officers who had escorted her in shifted uneasily, his face pale. He remembered the moment he had told her to move faster, the way she had obeyed without reaction. He remembered thinking she was cold, detached. Now he saw it for what it was, restraint, the kind that came from years of following orders without question, from surviving by control alone. Every detail that had seemed strange now made sense in a way that shamed him. The journalists began whispering again, though softer this time. They weren't sure how to write what they had just witnessed. Their pens hovered over paper, but no sentence seemed right. There was no villain here, only misunderstanding. A hero unseen until it was too late to treat her with the respect she deserved. The story had shifted from accusation to revelation, and every person in that courtroom had become part of it. The defense attorney finally spoke, his voice careful, almost reverent. He didn't argue anymore. He simply acknowledged what everyone already knew. His words were simple, factual, but the weight of them filled the space between each pause. The judge listened, silent, his gaze fixed on her. There was nothing to say that could undo the moment, nothing that could erase the image of her standing there, calm, unbroken, dignified. The chief still hadn't moved. He held her file in his hands. The paper creased slightly from his grip. He knew that no report, no apology, no explanation could make up for what had just taken place. Around him, the officers kept their eyes down, unable to meet her gaze. The realization of who she was had humbled them all. The authority they had worn like armor moments ago now felt hollow. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look around the room. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes met theirs, steady, quiet, neither accusing nor forgiving. It was a look that reminded them of every lesson they had forgotten, that strength doesn't always shout, that heroism doesn't always wear medals, and that the people who protect freedom often walk among others unseen, unrecognized. The silence that followed felt different now. It wasn't awkward, it was respectful. The same room that had judged her had become a place of acknowledgement. The echo of the handcuffs closing earlier still lingered in their minds, a reminder of how easily perception can turn into injustice. They all felt it, the sting of realization that they had treated valor like guilt, that they had restrained someone who had once defended the very ideals they claimed to uphold. The courtroom, once filled with procedure and noise, now stood suspended in that moment of understanding. No one dared to move too quickly or speak too soon. Every eye was on her, and every heart carried the same unspoken thought, that they had misjudged not only a person but the very idea of strength itself.